The water was black, not the black of night, but the black of depth and cold, and the Rhine River in April, carrying the melt from the Alps and the debris of a collapsing empire. Marlene Dietrich, no relation to the actress, just a farm girl from Bavaria who shared an unfortunate name, stopped kicking her legs at precisely 3:47 in the afternoon on April 12, 1945. She would remember the time because she had checked her wristwatch 3 minutes earlier, a nervous habit, and the watch had still been running even as the water seeped through its supposedly waterproof casing. German engineering, she had thought with something close to hysteria, promises that don't hold. The current of the Rhine moves at 8 miles per hour during spring melt. The temperature hovers around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The human body can survive in water this cold for perhaps 30 minutes before hypothermia shuts down the major organs. Less if you're already exhausted, already starving, already defeated in every way that matters before the water ever touches your skin. Marlene had been in the water for 11 minutes when she stopped fighting. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, the gray-green wool that had once made her feel purposeful and necessary, had absorbed what felt like its own weight in river water. Her boots, standard issue, fitted for men and too large for her feet even with extra socks, had filled completely in the first 30 seconds. She had tried to unlace them, fingers fumbling with knots swollen by cold water, but her hands had stopped obeying her brain somewhere around the 9-minute mark. Above her, the sky was the pale blue of early spring. Below her, nothing but the black. Around her, the Rhine carried her downstream, indifferent to her nationality, her politics, her increasingly frantic understanding that she was going to die out here in the middle of a river because she had believed what they told her about the Americans. 48 hours earlier, Marlene had been a telegraph operator stationed at what remained of the Ludendorff Bridge defensive position near Remagen. The bridge itself was gone, blown by retreating Wehrmacht engineers too late to stop the Americans from crossing, too early to do anything but strand the remaining German forces on the eastern bank. Her unit, the 23rd Women's Signal Auxiliary, had received its final orders at dawn on April 10th. Evacuate east, find German lines, rejoin the defense. The orders had come from a captain whose name she never learned, who had delivered them from the window of a commandeered Mercedes already packed with officers' belongings, already pointing toward Bavaria and the imagined safety of the Alpine fortress that existed mainly in Goebbels' radio broadcasts. The women had been left with a truck that had no fuel and a map that showed German positions from February. 23 women, ages 17 to 42, trained to operate telegraph equipment and decode messages, now expected to navigate 70 kilometers through American-occupied territory to reach lines that probably didn't exist anymore. The older women, the ones who had lived through the First War, had looked at each other with the expression Marlene was only beginning to recognize. The look that said, "We have been abandoned," the look that said, "This is how it ends." 6 of them had decided to surrender immediately. Better to face the Americans than die of exposure or starvation trying to reach phantom armies. 17 had decided to try for the river crossing. If they could reach the eastern bank, they might find German units, might find safety, might find anything except what they had been taught to expect from American captivity. The propaganda had been specific. Dr. Goebbels himself had devoted entire broadcasts to the topic. American soldiers, he had explained in that measured voice that made everything sound reasonable, were products of a mongrel nation. Mixed races, corrupted by Jewish influence, lacking any sense of European civilization or honor. They would treat German women the way the Bolsheviks treated them in the East. Rape, murder, degradation. The Americans would be worse, Goebbels had said, because they would pretend to be civilized first. They would offer candy and cigarettes and stockings, and then they would do what savage men always did to conquered women. Marlene had believed this, not because she was stupid, though she would spend the rest of her life wondering if belief and stupidity were really so different. She had believed it because she was 19 years old and had never been outside of Bavaria before the war, because her teachers had told her, because the radio said so, because the alternative, that her government had been lying to her since she was 7 years old, was too enormous to contemplate. So when the 17 women had reached the Rhine at dusk on April 11th and seen the width of it, the speed of it, the absolute impossibility of it, 8 of them had turned back immediately. 9 had waded in. Marlene had been the 4th into the water. The first girl, Frieda Hoffmann from Hamburg, had grown up sailing and could swim like she was born to it. She had struck out with confident strokes, angling upstream to compensate for the current, and Marlene had watched her actually make progress toward the far shore. The second girl had panicked 20 meters out and thrashed her way back to the western bank, sobbing. The third girl had simply vanished. One moment she was there, dark head bobbing in the twilight, and then she wasn't. No scream, no splash, just the river taking what the river wanted. Marlene had kept swimming. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed by 1,000 knives simultaneously, and then it felt like nothing at all, which was worse. She had used the breaststroke her father had taught her in the lake near their farm, back when there had been time for swimming and fathers and farms that weren't worked by Polish prisoners. She had kept her breathing steady, had tried not to think about the weight of her boots or the way her uniform was dragging her down or the fact that the far shore didn't seem to be getting any closer. Somewhere around the 8-minute mark, she had heard voices, American voices, English, shouted across water. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. They were telling her something, warning her, or ordering her, or offering her something. She didn't know. She only knew that the voices came from the western shore, the shore she was swimming away from, the shore where the enemies were. And then, at 11 minutes, as her vision started to tunnel and her kicks became feeble and her arms could barely complete their strokes, Marlene Dietrich had a moment of perfect clarity. She was going to drown. The far shore was unreachable. Her strength was gone. And the Americans, the terrible Americans she had been swimming away from, had been trying to warn her to come back. They had been trying to save her. That realization was what made her stop fighting. Not exhaustion, though exhaustion was there. Not cold, though the cold had turned her body into something foreign and unresponsive. She stopped fighting because she understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes right before the end, that everything had been a lie. The Americans weren't chasing her into the river. They were calling her back from it, and she had chosen drowning over their mercy because she had believed what she had been told. The moment she stopped kicking, she sank. Not immediately, but gradually, the way a leaf sinks when it finally absorbs enough water to overcome its buoyancy. Her arms went limp. Her legs stopped their weak flutter kicks. She felt the water close over her head, and she didn't fight it. She opened her eyes underwater and saw nothing but black and particles of silt, and something that might have been a fish, or might have been her imagination. She sank 3 meters, 5, 7. The pressure built in her ears. Her lungs began to burn. And some part of her, the part that had been trained since childhood to follow orders, to believe what she was told, to accept what seemed inevitable, said, "This is appropriate. This is what you deserve for being part of this. Let the river have you." But another part, smaller and newer and insistent, said, "You were lied to. About the Americans. About everything. Don't you want to know what else was a lie?" She didn't have time to answer herself, because at that moment, 10 meters from the western shore and 3 meters below the surface, Thomas Chen grabbed her. Private First Class Thomas Chen of San Francisco, California, age 23, second-generation Chinese-American, combat engineer with the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, reached Marlene Dietrich with the last of his strength and wrapped one arm around her chest and began to kick toward the surface. His lungs were screaming. His vision was edged with black spots. This was his third dive in 15 minutes, and the cold had turned his body into something barely functional, but he kicked anyway. Because she was sinking, because he had seen her go under, because someone had to be the third guy. Chen had been working on the pontoon bridge for 47 hours straight when the German women had started trying to cross the river. He and his unit had been under sporadic artillery fire for most of that time, working in rotations to build the floating bridge that would allow American armor to push deeper into Germany. They had lost 2 men to shell fire, 3 more to accidents with the heavy equipment. Combat engineering was the kind of work that killed you even when the enemy wasn't trying. When the first woman had entered the water, Chen had been taking a break, sitting on the muddy riverbank with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He had watched her swim, had admired her technique, had thought she might actually make it. When the second woman had panicked, he had stood up, ready to go in if needed. When the third woman had disappeared, he had already been unlacing his boots. His sergeant, William Patterson from Alabama, had stopped him. "Chen, you go in that water. You might not come back. You're already half frozen." Chen had looked at his sergeant and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "They're trying to escape from us, Sarge. What does that say about what they think we are?" Patterson had been quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Make it quick, and for God's sake, be careful." The first dive had been for a German sergeant, a man in his 40s who had gone under 20 meters from shore. Chen had reached him in time, had fought the man's panic, had taken a solid punch to the jaw before managing to get the sergeant into a cross-chest carry and pull him to shore. The German had coughed up what seemed like a gallon of Rhine water, had looked at Chen with absolute confusion, and had said in broken English, "You saved me? Why?" Chen hadn't answered. He had been too busy catching his breath, too cold to form words, too focused on the fact that there were still shapes in the water, still people drowning. The second dive had been for a boy, couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform 3 sizes too large, drowning 15 meters out. Chen had been colder this time, his muscles less responsive, his swimming less efficient. But he had reached the boy, had pulled him back, had delivered him to the medic who was setting up a warming station on the bank. His captain, Robert Morrison from Vermont, had ordered him out of the water. "Chen, you've done enough. You go hypothermic. You're no good to anyone." Chen had been sitting on the bank, wrapped in a wool blanket, shivering so hard his teeth rattled, when he had seen Marlene's dark hair spreading on the surface of the water, spreading like a flower, like his sister May's hair when she floated in the pool at Crystal Plunge back in San Francisco. May was 18. This girl looked about the same age. He had dropped the blanket and gone in before anyone could stop him. The cold hit him like a physical blow. His body tried to refuse, tried to make him turn back, but he swam anyway. Pushed through water that felt like molasses, arms heavy, legs barely kicking. He saw her sink, saw the pale flash of her face disappearing into the black, and he dove. 3 meters down, the current was different, swirling, pulling. His ears popped, his lungs burned. He swept his arms wide, searching, and his hand caught fabric. Wool, uniform. He grabbed, pulled, wrapped his arm around her chest. She was completely limp, dead weight. No struggle, no resistance, nothing. He kicked, once, twice. His legs felt like they were moving through concrete. His lungs screamed for air. The surface was right there. He could see the light, but it might as well have been miles away. He kicked again, and then other hands were grabbing him, grabbing her, pulling them both up and out. Air hit his face like a miracle. He gasped, coughed, tried to draw breath, and got river water instead. Someone was pounding his back. Someone else was laying the German girl on the mud, turning her on her side. Chen heard himself coughing, heard the wet rattling sound, felt strong hands pulling him away from the water's edge. "You crazy son of a bitch," Patterson was saying, but his voice was gentle. "You beautiful crazy son of a bitch." Chen couldn't respond. He was shaking too hard. They wrapped him in blankets, 3 of them, and sat him by a fire that had been built for exactly this purpose. Across the small clearing, he could see the medic working on the German girl. Sergeant Robert Morrison, the unit medic from Tennessee, pressing on her chest, breathing into her mouth, working with the kind of calm efficiency that came from doing this too many times. "Come on, sweetheart," Morrison was saying. "Come on back. You didn't swim all that way to quit now." Water poured from her mouth, once, twice, and then she coughed, a wet, terrible sound, and her eyes opened. Chen watched from 20 feet away as Marlene Dietrich returned to life. Watched her eyes open, watched confusion and fear cross her face, watched her see the American uniform surrounding her, and watched her entire body tense for violence that would not come. Morrison kept his hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm. "Easy now. You're safe. You're okay. Just breathe." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. And that, Chen thought, as the shaking began to subside and the warmth of the fire began to penetrate the layers of cold, was where everything would change. In the gap between what she had been taught to expect and what was actually happening. In the moment when propaganda met reality and reality won. She had stopped fighting in the water. Now she would have to decide whether to start fighting again or to accept what these Americans were actually offering. Not brutality, not degradation, just warmth and breath and the chance to live. Chen closed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure, and thought about his sister May. Thought about what he would want someone to do if she had been drowning in a river, terrified and alone, in a country that wasn't hers. He would want someone to dive in, even if it was the third dive, even if they were exhausted, even if she was supposed to be the enemy. Someone had to be the third guy. That was the thought he held as unconsciousness took him, wrapped in blankets by a fire on the banks of the Rhine, while 20 feet away a German girl coughed up river water and began the long process of understanding that everything she had believed was a lie. Marlene woke in a tent that smelled of canvas and disinfectant and something she couldn't identify for several moments before realizing it was real coffee. Not the acorn substitute that had been passing for coffee in Germany since 1943. Not the roasted barley mixture, real coffee, with a smell so rich and distinctive that it took her several seconds to remember what actual coffee smelled like. She was warm. That was the second thing she registered. Warm in a way she had not been in months, maybe years. Wrapped in wool blankets that were thick and clean, lying on a cot that had a mattress. A thin one, but a mattress nonetheless. Her wet uniform was gone. In its place, she wore what appeared to be American military clothing, a shirt several sizes too large, pants that had been rolled at the cuffs, dry socks that were possibly the most luxurious thing she had ever felt against her skin. The tent had 6 cots. 2 were empty. 3 held other German soldiers. She could see the gray-green of Wehrmacht uniforms hanging on the tent poles to dry. One held an elderly man who was sleeping with the deep exhaustion of someone who had been cold for too long. Another held a teenage boy who might have been the same one she had seen in the water. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, tears running silently down his face. Marlene tried to sit up. Her body protested. Every muscle ached. Her lungs felt raw. Her throat burned. She managed to prop herself up on one elbow and immediately started coughing, the wet, rattling cough of someone who had breathed in too much river. A woman appeared, American uniform, lieutenant's bars, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She was carrying a metal cup and moved with the kind of efficient calm that suggested medical training. She sat on the edge of Marlene's cot and held the cup to her lips. "Drink," she said in German. Perfect German. No accent. Small sips. Marlene drank. Water, clean and cold, the best thing she had ever tasted. She coughed again, spraying water, and the nurse, she had to be a nurse, simply wiped Marlene's mouth with a clean cloth and waited for the coughing to subside. "You're lucky to be alive," the woman said, still in German. "Another minute in that water and we would have lost you. As it was close." Marlene found her voice. It came out as a croak. "Who are you?" "Lieutenant Helen Kowalski, Army Nurse Corps. My parents came from Poland, so I grew up speaking German at home." She set the water cup on a small table beside the cot. "What's your name?" Marlene hesitated. Name, rank, serial number. That was what you were supposed to give. But she was so tired, and this woman had kind eyes, and the propaganda seemed very far away when you were wrapped in American blankets drinking American water in an American tent. "Marlene Dietrich," she said, and then added quickly, "Not the actress." Kowalski smiled. "I figured. You're younger, and you were swimming in the Rhine, which seems out of character for her." She stood, checked Marlene's pulse at her wrist, peered into her eyes. "How do you feel? Cold? Tired? Alive?" Marlene paused. "Confused." "The confusion is reasonable." Kowalski moved to a small cabinet and returned with a plate of food. White bread, real butter, a can of peaches, a chocolate bar still in its wrapper. She set the plate on Marlene's lap. "Eat. You need calories to warm up properly." Marlene stared at the food, at the abundance of it, at the casual way it had been presented, as if this was normal, as if feeding the enemy was just something you did on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about the rations she had been eating for the past year, the bread that was more sawdust than grain, the soup that was more water than vegetables, the constant gnawing hunger that had become so normal she had stopped thinking of it as hunger and started thinking of it as just the way bodies felt. "I can't," she said. Kowalski raised an eyebrow. "Can't eat? Or won't eat?" "I don't—" Marlene stopped. What was she trying to say? That accepting American food felt like collaboration? That eating while her country starved felt like betrayal? That the existence of this abundance made everything she had believed a lie, and she wasn't ready to face that truth? "It's not poisoned," Kowalski said gently. "And it's not charity. It's medical treatment. You nearly drowned. Your body needs fuel." She stood, moved toward the tent opening. "I'll leave it here. Eat when you're ready. Or don't. Your choice." The phrase hung in the air after Kowalski left. Your choice. When had Marlene last made a choice? The war had been chosen for her. The uniform had been mandatory. The postings assigned. The beliefs enforced. Even drowning in the Rhine had not really been a choice, but a response to propaganda, to fear, to the absence of any other option. But this was a choice. The food sat on her lap, undeniably real, undeniably abundant, undeniably hers if she wanted it. No one was watching. No one would know if she ate or didn't eat. It was, genuinely, her decision. She picked up the can of peaches. The label was in English, but the picture was clear. She had not seen peaches since before the war. The can had a pull-tab opener, simple and elegant. American engineering. She pulled the tab, and the smell hit her immediately. Sweet, impossibly sweet. The sugar syrup, like something from a dream of childhood. She lifted the can to her lips and drank the syrup first. It was so sweet it almost hurt. And then she began to cry. Not from gratitude, not from relief. She cried because the existence of this can of peaches, mass-produced and abundant enough to be given casually to enemy prisoners, meant that everything had been a lie. Germany had been starving while America had peaches for every soldier. The mighty Reich had been feeding its people sawdust while the mongrel democracy across the ocean had chocolate bars in every pocket. She cried because she had believed in superiority while eating garbage, and the inferior race had saved her life and given her peaches. She ate them anyway, all of them, and the bread, and the chocolate, which was like nothing she had ever tasted, rich and smooth and sweet. And when she was done, she lay back on the American cot under American blankets in an American tent, and she thought, what else did they lie about? What else? 3 hours later, a soldier appeared at the tent opening. Not Kowalski. A man, young, Asian features, wrapped in blankets, and moving stiffly. He was accompanied by another soldier who was clearly translating, and by Kowalski herself, who seemed to be there in a medical capacity. "Miss Dietrich," Kowalski said, "this is Private First Class Thomas Chen. He's the one who pulled you from the river. He'd like to speak with you if you're feeling well enough." Marlene sat up slowly. She looked at the young man, the one who had dove in 3 times, who had saved her when she had stopped saving herself. He looked exhausted. His hands were bandaged. His lips had a bluish tinge that suggested he was still recovering from hypothermia. He had risked his life for her, possibly damaged his health permanently for her, and she didn't know why. The translator, a corporal with a Milwaukee accent and perfect German, stepped forward. "Private Chen wanted to ask you something, if you're willing to answer." Marlene nodded. Chen spoke in English. The translator related in German. Why did you stop fighting? In the water. I saw you go under. You just stopped. It was the question she had been asking herself. Marlene looked at this young soldier who had saved her, and she decided to tell the truth. Because I realized it didn't matter, she said. The translator relayed it. Drown or be captured. You would do what you were going to do. I had been taught what Americans do to German women, to prisoners. I thought drowning was better. She watched Chen's face as the translation came through, watched him process what she had said, watched the color drain from his already pale features, replaced by something that looked like horror. He said something sharply in English. The translator hesitated, then rendered it. We pulled you out of the river. We gave you medical care. We fed you. Yes, Marlene said directly to Chen, even though he couldn't understand her. Why? The translator relayed it. Chen stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet. The translator said, because you were drowning. What else would we do? And there it was. The question that unraveled everything. What else would they do? In the world Marlene had been taught to believe in, enemies did not save each other. Conquerors did not show mercy. Superior races did not risk themselves for inferior ones. But this Chinese-American soldier from a mongrel nation had dove into freezing water 3 times, had nearly killed himself, to save a German girl who had been drowning because she believed he was a monster. Marlene sat forward, meeting Chen's eyes directly for the first time. She saw exhaustion there, confusion, but also something else. Something that looked like the gentle concern you might show a younger sister, something human. Are you Chinese? She asked. The translator relayed it. Chen nodded. American. My parents came from China. Marlene thought about the racial theory she had been taught in school, the hierarchy of peoples, the supremacy of the Aryan race, the mongrelization of America being its fatal weakness. And here was this mongrel who had crossed an ocean, fought through France and Germany, built bridges under fire, and dove into freezing water 3 times to save people he had every reason to hate. Thank you, she said in English. The first English word she had spoken. Thank you for my life. Chen's expression softened. He nodded, said something else. The translator smiled slightly. He says he's glad you're okay. He kept thinking about his sister. She's about your age. He says someone had to be the 3rd guy. The 3rd guy? Marlene asked. He saved 2 men before you. His commanding officer ordered him out of the water. He went in anyway. Marlene felt something shift in her chest. This man had disobeyed orders to save her, had risked court-martial, had risked his life, for someone he had been at war with hours earlier, for someone whose army had been killing his friends for years. Why? She asked again. Why 3 times? Chen answered directly, and the translator said, because you were drowning, all 3 of you. Someone drowning is someone drowning, regardless of what uniform they used to wear. Used to wear? Past tense? The war was over for her, Marlene realized. She was no longer Wehrmacht. She was no longer a soldier. She was just someone who had nearly drowned and had been saved by a man who believed that drowning people deserved to be saved. It was the simplest possible moral framework, and it destroyed everything she had been taught. Chen stood to leave, moving stiffly, clearly in pain. At the tent opening he paused and said something else. The translator smiled again and said, he says he hopes you find peace, and that he's glad you chose to keep living once you got the chance. And then he was gone, and Marlene was alone with Kowalski and the translator and the remains of her worldview scattered around her like the debris of a collapsed bridge. He's a good kid, Kowalski said in German. Barely speaks, just does his job. Saves who needs saving, builds what needs building. She checked Marlene's pulse again, professional and efficient. You'll be moved to a POW processing center tomorrow. Standard procedure. You'll be fed, given medical care, processed for release once the formalities are done. And then? Marlene asked. Then you go home, back to wherever home is, back to whatever's left of it. Kowalski paused. The war is ending, Marlene. Maybe already ended, depending on what happens in Berlin. Soon you'll be able to start choosing what comes next. What you believe, what you do, who you want to be. After Kowalski left, Marlene lay in the darkness of the tent and thought about choices. She had chosen to swim the river, had chosen to believe the propaganda, had chosen, in that final moment underwater, to stop fighting. And Chen had chosen to dive in anyway, had chosen mercy over vengeance, had chosen to save her even when she had given up on herself. Tomorrow, she would be moved to a POW camp. Eventually, she would be released. Eventually, she would go home to Bavaria, to whatever remained of her mother's house, to whatever remained of Germany, and she would carry with her the knowledge that she had been saved by someone she had been taught to despise, that the enemy had shown more humanity than her own leaders, that the mongrel nation had abundance, while the superior race had starved. She would carry the memory of Private Chen's face, the exhaustion, the kindness, the simple, devastating question, what else would we do? It was the question that would define the rest of her life, because if they had lied about this, about the nature of the enemy, about the character of Americans, about the weakness of democracy, then they had lied about everything, and Marlene would spend the next decades learning what truth looked like after you had lived your entire young life inside a lie. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight she was warm and fed and alive, saved by the third dive, given a choice she had thought was lost. And for the first time in years, possibly her entire life, she had no idea what would happen next. It was terrifying, and it was freedom. The POW processing center at Remagen occupied what had once been a Wehrmacht barracks. The irony was not lost on Marlene as she stood in the registration line on a cool morning in late April, watching American soldiers efficiently process the flood of surrendering Germans. The same buildings that had housed soldiers preparing to defend the Rhine now held those soldiers as prisoners, fed by the enemy they had failed to stop. The line moved slowly. Ahead of her, a man in his 60s argued with the translator about his age, insisting he had been forced into the Volkssturm, that he was not a real soldier. Behind her, two teenagers stood in silence, boys who looked like they should be in school, not war. Everyone shuffling forward carried the same expression. Exhaustion mixed with relief, mixed with shame, mixed with something else Marlene was only beginning to recognize in herself. The dawning understanding that survival might actually be possible. The registration process was mechanical. Name, rank, unit, hometown. A medical officer checked for injuries, diseases, lice. Marlene was deloused, photographed, fingerprinted, assigned a prisoner number that she would forget within a week because the Americans barely used it. They called prisoners by name, which seemed strange. Respectful even. She received new clothes. Not a uniform, but civilian clothing from stores the Americans had established. A dress that was too large, wool stockings, shoes that almost fit. The transformation from soldier to civilian happened in 15 minutes at a distribution table staffed by a bored corporal from Detroit who handed her the clothes and said in broken German, "Next." The women's barracks held 80 prisoners in bunks, stacked 3 high. Marlene was assigned a middle bunk near the window, which the older women told her was lucky. Air circulation mattered in a room this crowded. She placed her few possessions on the thin mattress, the clothes she had been wearing, now cleaned and returned, and a small bag containing the chocolate bar wrapper she had kept from that first day. She did not know why she kept it, perhaps as evidence, proof that the abundance was real. That evening, she met the women who would become her companions in processing. Frida Hoffman sat on the bunk below hers, the same Frida who had made it across the Rhine to the eastern shore, only to find more Americans and surrender anyway. Frida was 24, from Hamburg, and possessed a bitter humor about their situation. "We swam toward the same thing from opposite directions," she said that first night. "At least you had the sense to let them pull you out. I wore myself to exhaustion for nothing." There was Frau Hoffman, no relation to Frida, a woman of 54 who had been a party member since 1933 and was now very carefully not discussing it. Her son had died at Stalingrad in 1943. She spoke of him once, late at night when sleep would not come, and said simply, "They told me he died for greatness, but I eat better here than I did during the greatness. What does that mean?" No one answered her. Everyone knew what it meant. The days developed a rhythm. Wake at 6 to American bugles playing reveille. Breakfast at 7, served by American cooks who dished out oatmeal and powdered eggs and coffee and bread without apparent resentment. Work assignments at 8, cleaning details, laundry, kitchen help, tasks that kept the camp functioning and gave the prisoners something to do besides think. Lunch at noon, more work, dinner at 5, evening free time until lights out at 10. It was during free time that Marlene began to watch the Americans, not as enemies, but as subjects of study. She watched how they interacted with each other, the casual democracy of it. Enlisted men arguing with sergeants about baseball scores, officers eating the same food as privates, black soldiers and white soldiers working side by side, though she noticed they often separated during meals, a division that seemed to come from the Americans themselves, not imposed from above. It confused her. The propaganda had said America's racial mixing made it weak, but here was a segregated army that had crossed an ocean and conquered Europe. Nothing made sense in the ways she had been taught to expect. One afternoon, working in the camp gardens pulling weeds from vegetable plots the Americans were establishing, Marlene encountered Sergeant Morrison, the medic from Tennessee who had brought her back to life on the riverbank. He was supervising the garden work, though supervision mostly meant sitting on a crate and smoking while the German prisoners did the actual labor. "You're the river girl," he said in English, then repeated it through a translator who happened to be passing. "Doing better?" Marlene nodded. She had been practicing English in her bunk at night, whispering words to herself, trying to match sounds to the phrases she heard during the day. She attempted it now. "Yes, thank you." Morrison smiled. Your English is pretty good. Keep practicing, you'll pick it up quick. Smart girl like you. He offered her a cigarette, which she declined, then a piece of hard candy, which she accepted. Butterscotch, sweet and golden, probably worth more than a week of Wehrmacht rations. He gave it without ceremony, without expectation, the way you might give candy to a child who had scraped her knee. Why you help us? Marlene asked in halting English. We are enemy. Morrison considered this while lighting a new cigarette. The translator had stopped, interested in the conversation. Finally, Morrison spoke, and the translator rendered it into smoother German. War's over for you folks. Enemy is a thing you are during fighting. After fighting stops, you're just people who need help. Seems simple enough. But it was not simple, Marlene wanted to say. It was the opposite of simple. It required a framework of thought completely different from the one she had been raised in. It required believing that humanity persisted beyond nationality, that mercy could be strategic, that strength included the capacity for gentleness. It required an entirely different understanding of what civilization meant. She did not have the English to explain this, so she simply said, "Thank you, for life, for candy, for everything." Morrison shrugged. "Just doing what needs doing. You pull a drowning person from a river, you feed hungry people, you help where you can help. Ain't complicated." He stood, grinding out the cigarette under his boot. "Get back to your weeding. Those tomatoes aren't going to grow themselves." That night, lying in her bunk while 80 women breathed and shifted and dreamed around her, Marlene thought about Morrison's words. Ain't complicated. But it was complicated. Desperately so, because accepting his simple framework meant rejecting everything the Reich had built itself upon. The Reich had been complicated. Hierarchies of race and value, theories of superiority and destiny, elaborate justifications for cruelty. The Americans offered something simpler and somehow more radical. Help where you can help. She fell asleep thinking about Private Chen, wondering if he thought about her, deciding he probably did not. He had pulled 3 people from the river that day. She was just one. Just another drowning person who needed help. The thought should have been diminishing, but instead it was oddly comforting. She had not been special. She had just been human, and that had been enough. 6 weeks into her internment, the Americans established an education program. Voluntary classes in English, in democratic principles, in the history of what Germany had actually done during the war. Most prisoners avoided the history classes. The truth was too fresh, too terrible. But Marlene attended everything. She sat in a converted storage room with 20 other Germans and listened to a lieutenant from Wisconsin explain the American Constitution. Listened to him describe a government where power changed hands peacefully, where leaders were chosen not by force but by vote, where individuals possessed rights that even the state could not violate. "Does it work?" Frau Hoffmann asked through the translator. "This system of yours, or is it just what you tell us, like we were told things?" The lieutenant, a young man named Patterson who had studied political science before the war, did not take offense. "It works imperfectly. We have corruption, we have failures, we had slavery, which was our great national sin, and we fought a civil war over it, and we're still dealing with the consequences. We deny rights to Negro citizens we should grant. We interned Japanese citizens during this war, which was wrong and which we'll have to answer for." He paused. "But the system allows for correction, allows for change, allows for people to organize and protest and vote for something better. You can't do that under a dictatorship. Under a dictatorship, wrong just continues until everything collapses." Marlene raised her hand. "How you trust people to choose correctly, to vote for good leaders?" Patterson smiled. "You don't. People make mistakes. They vote for bad leaders sometimes. But the system survives the bad leaders because power is distributed, because terms are limited, because no one person can destroy everything." He leaned forward. "Your system put all power in one man's hands. Ours spreads it around, makes it harder to do great evil quickly, also makes it harder to do great good quickly, which is frustrating, but the trade-off seems worth it." After class, Marlene walked back to the barracks thinking about trade-offs. The Reich had promised greatness and delivered ruin. Democracy promised only the chance to choose, to correct, to muddle forward imperfectly. It was such a modest promise compared to the soaring rhetoric she had grown up with. And yet the modest system had produced the abundance she saw every day in this camp. The chocolate and coffee and cigarettes and medicine and food, and the casual kindness of men like Chen and Morrison. That evening, she wrote another letter home. Not the safe one she had sent 3 weeks earlier, but the honest one. She wrote to her mother about drowning and being saved, about chocolate bars and English classes, about learning that everything had been lies. She wrote, "I do not know who I am anymore, Mutti. The girl who believed in the Reich died in the river. The Americans pulled out someone different. I am trying to learn who this new person might be." This letter, too, she did not send, but she kept it with the first honest letter, folded together, a record of transformation that had no witness except herself. 37 years later, Marlene Schultz sat in her office at the University of Munich and watched an American documentary crew set up lights and cameras among her bookshelves. She was 56 now, her dark hair gone gray, her face lined with decades of teaching and thinking and remembering. The office walls were covered with books about denazification, democratic transition, the psychology of belief and propaganda. Her own books occupied one shelf, 7 volumes spanning 4 decades of scholarship on how societies transform after collapse. The interviewer was a young woman from PBS, earnest and thorough, who had spent the morning asking careful questions about Marlene's work. Now, as the cameras rolled, she asked the question Marlene had known was coming. Professor Schultz, your research focuses on the personal experience of denazification, but you lived it yourself. Can you tell us about April 12, 1945? Marlene folded her hands in her lap, the gesture of a woman who had told this story before, but never casually. I tried to drown myself rather than be captured by American soldiers. I had been taught that capture would be worse than death. An American soldier named Thomas Chen saved me anyway. It was his 3rd dive into the Rhine that afternoon. He nearly died from hypothermia pulling me out. Why did he do it? Because I was drowning. That was his answer when I asked him the same question. He could not understand why I would ask. To him it was obvious. You save drowning people. The war had taught him to kill when necessary, but it had not taught him to let people die when he could save them. The interviewer leaned forward. How did that change you? Marlene was quiet for a long moment, choosing words carefully. It broke me. In the necessary way. I had been raised to believe that some people were inherently superior to others. That democracy made nations weak. That mercy was for inferior races. Private Chen was Chinese American. From what we had been taught was a mongrel nation. He was everything we had been told to despise. And he was stronger than me. Braver than me. Kinder than me. His system had produced abundance while ours produced starvation. His values led him to save enemies while our values led us to create death camps. She stopped, steadied her breathing. The crew waited. When you believe lies that completely, having them shattered is not gentle. It is violent. I spent months after my capture trying to reconcile what I had believed with what I had experienced. Eventually I realized you cannot reconcile them. You can only choose which version of reality to accept. I chose the reality where mercy was strength and democracy worked, and people had inherent worth regardless of race or nationality. I chose it because I had seen it, had lived it, had been saved by it. The interview continued for another hour. Marlene spoke about her work, about teaching generations of German students to recognize propaganda, to question authority, to understand how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. She spoke about the importance of remembering, of not allowing shame to become forgetfulness, of building something better on the ruins of what had failed. When the crew packed their equipment, the interviewer mentioned they had tracked down Thomas Chen. He was alive, 60 years old, living in Sacramento, California. He had agreed to an interview. Would Marlene be willing to meet him for the documentary? Marlene said yes before she fully processed what yes meant. They arranged it for 2 weeks later in Munich. The university provided a quiet room. The documentary crew promised to be unobtrusive. Marlene spent the intervening days in a state of anxiety she had not felt since her graduate exams. What did you say to someone who had saved your life 37 years ago? How had he changed? Had he thought of her at all in the decades since? When the door opened and Thomas Chen walked in, Marlene stood from her chair too quickly and had to steady herself on the desk. He was older, gray-haired, moving with the slight stiffness of age, but his face was unmistakable. The same gentle eyes, the same quiet presence. "Hello, Private Chen," she said in English that was now fluent, barely accented. He smiled. "Just Tom now, or Thomas. Either works." They sat. Coffee appeared, provided by the efficient crew. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people whose lives had intersected violently and briefly, and then diverged completely. "They told me you became a professor," Chen said. "That's wonderful. Teaching what? History, political psychology, how people change their beliefs when confronted with contradictory evidence." Marlene smiled slightly. "I had rather dramatic personal experience with the subject." Chen nodded. "I read one of your books, the one about denazification. Had it translated. You're a good writer, clear thinker." "You saved my life," Marlene said, the words coming out more abruptly than she intended. "I have wanted to thank you properly for 37 years. "You thanked me then, in the tent. Your English was terrible, but I understood. I thanked you for pulling me from the water. I did not know how to thank you for everything else, for showing me that everything I believed was wrong, for giving me the chance to become someone different." Chen was quiet, processing this. Finally he said, "I just pulled you out of the water, Marlene. Everything after that was you. You chose to learn, chose to change, chose to spend your life teaching others. I gave you maybe 30 more seconds of life. You built everything else yourself. You dove in 3 times, Marlene said. You were exhausted. You had already saved 2 people. Your captain ordered you to stop. You dove in anyway. Why? Chen looked out the window at the Munich skyline, considering. I saw your hair on the water. It looked like my sister's hair. She was about your age then. I thought, if May were drowning in a river in a foreign country, I would want someone to be the third guy, want someone to go in even when it was hard, even when they had already done enough. He turned back to Marlene. So I went in. It was not about politics or systems or proving anything. It was just about not letting someone drown when I could stop it. They talked for 2 hours. Chen told her about his life after the war, returning to San Francisco, becoming an engineer, building bridges, raising 3 children with his wife Helen, never talking much about the war, except to tell the story of the river when his children asked why they should help people who seemed beyond help. Marlene told him about her transformation, the POW camp, the education classes, returning to Bavaria to find her mother's house damaged but standing, her mother alive but diminished, the village trying to pretend the last 12 years had not happened, going to university on American scholarship money, studying history and psychology, writing, teaching, spending decades trying to understand how an entire nation had believed lies and what it took to accept truth. Do you still think about that day? Chen asked. Every single day of my life, Marlene said. It was the day I died and was reborn. The day everything I knew became false and everything I feared became safety. You were the hinge moment of my entire existence. Chen looked uncomfortable with this weight. I think about it sometimes. Mostly I think about how cold the water was. How heavy you were, all that wet wool. How sure I was that we were both going to drown. He smiled slightly. I'm glad we didn't. I am too, Marlene said. And then, after a pause, can I ask you something I have wondered about for decades? After you saved me? After you saw what the propaganda had taught me to believe about Americans? About you specifically? How did you feel? Were you angry? Chen considered this carefully. I was sad. Sad that you had been taught to fear the people who would help you? Sad that your leaders had lied so thoroughly that you chose drowning over rescue? Sad that war makes people believe terrible things about each other? He paused. But angry? No. You were 19 years old. You believed what you were taught. Most people do. I was lucky to be taught different things. That does not make me better than you. Just luckier. It was the most generous interpretation possible, and Marlene felt tears threatening. You are a good man, Thomas Chen. I try to be. Mostly, I just try to help where I can help. Build things that need building. Pull out people who are drowning, literally or otherwise. When they parted, they embraced. Not romantically, but with the profound connection of 2 people whose lives had intersected in a way that changed everything. Chen returned to California. Marlene returned to her teaching. The documentary aired 6 months later, watched by millions. The story of the third dive becoming one small thread in the larger tapestry of reconciliation between former enemies. Marlene lived another 15 years, teaching until the month before she died at 71. Her last book, published posthumously, was dedicated to Thomas Chen, who dove in 3 times, and to all the third guys who chose mercy over revenge. Chen lived until 1997, dying peacefully at 75, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew the story of the girl in the river, who had been raised on the principle that you help when you can help, that you dive in even when you are tired, even when it is hard, even when you have already done enough. The story became part of history, a footnote in the larger narrative of Germany's transformation from dictatorship to democracy, from enemy to ally. But for Marlene Schultz, it was never a footnote. It was everything, the moment when propaganda met reality, when lies shattered against truth, when a drowning girl stopped fighting and an exhausted soldier dove in anyway, and in that moment created the possibility for something different, something better. Years after both were gone, a historian researching American-German reconciliation found Marlene's unsent letters, preserved in her papers, donated to the university. The honest ones, written but never mailed, documenting her transformation from believer to questioner to teacher. The final letter, written the week before she died, contained a single line. I have spent my life trying to be worthy of the third dive. I hope I have succeeded. She had.